Whispers in the fog. The bus rolled to a halt with a hiss of hydraulics, its headlights piercing through the heavy mist that blanketed the countryside. Clara stepped off, clutching her duffel bag as the icy air bit at her cheeks. Blackthorn Hollow, a small village tucked deep in the English moors, was nothing like the bustling city she'd left behind. This place felt timeless, caught in a perpetual gray haze, as though even the sun dared not linger too long. Clara had inherited her great-uncle's estate, an old manor that had stood for centuries at the edge of the village. She had never met the man. Family stories painted him as a recluse, a strange and secretive figure. When the solicitor's letter arrived, she had debated selling the property unseen. But something about the mystery of it had called to her. Perhaps it was the thrill of the unknown, or simply the desire to escape the monotony of her life. As she approached the lone taxi waiting by the road, its driver gave her a wary glance. "You're headed to Blackthorn Manor, miss?" he asked, his thick accent adding to the eerie ambiance. Clara nodded. "Yes, that's right." The man hesitated, his hand lingering on the door. "Not many folks go up there anymore. You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Clara replied firmly, though a sliver of doubt crept into her voice. The driver's expression did little to ease her nerves as they set off down the winding path. The manor loomed like a shadow out of the fog, its Gothic architecture both beautiful and foreboding. The once grand gardens were now wild and untamed, their paths choked with weeds. Clara stepped out of the taxi, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots echoing in the stillness. The driver didn't linger, leaving her alone with her inheritance and the weight of its history. The front door creaked open as Clara pushed against it, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through stained glass windows. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and neglect. She felt an inexplicable chill as she crossed the threshold, as though the house itself was watching. Exploring the manor, Clara found room after room filled with antique furniture and relics from another era. The library drew her attention most. Its shelves were lined with leather-bound tomes, many of which seemed older than the house itself. A large desk sat near the center, papers scattered across its surface. Among them was a journal, its pages filled with her great-uncle's neat handwriting. The entries were peculiar, detailing strange occurrences and whispered voices heard in the dead of night. One passage stood out. "The fog is alive. It whispers truths and lies, drawing closer with every dusk. Beware the nights when it envelops the house entirely. Those are the nights it hungers." Clara's heart raced as she read the words. She closed the journal and resolved to unpack her things. The day had been long, and she needed rest. But as night fell, the whispers began. Clara awoke to the sound of murmuring, faint but unmistakable. At first she thought it was the wind, but as she lay still, straining her ears, the voices grew clearer. They were coming from outside, drifting through the fog like spectral echoes. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, Clara approached the window. The fog had thickened, shrouding the grounds in a milky veil. Shadows moved within it, indistinct but unsettling. She could almost make out words in the whispers, though their meaning eluded her. A sudden knock at the front door shattered the stillness. Clara froze, her breath hitching. Who could be calling at this hour? Summoning her courage, she made her way downstairs. The old staircase creaked under her weight, each step amplifying her dread. When she opened the door, no one was there. The fog swirled, cold and oppressive, as though it had been waiting for her. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, seeping through the walls. Clara pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out. Then, as abruptly as they had started, they stopped. The next morning, Clara visited the village to gather supplies and perhaps learn more about the manor. The locals were polite but distant, their gazes wary when she mentioned where she was staying. Only one person seemed willing to talk, an elderly woman named Margaret who ran the local apothecary. "Blackthorn Manor has always been peculiar," Margaret said, her voice low. "Your great-uncle kept to himself, but he was always kind to me. He spoke of the whispers, too. Clara leaned in. What are they? Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as though expecting someone to eavesdrop. The fog isn't natural, she said finally. It's tied to the land, to the house. Some say it's a curse, others believe it's a doorway. Whatever it is, you'd do well to be careful. Don't trust the voices. Clara's curiosity deepened, though so did her unease. Margaret handed her a bundle of herbs. Burn these at night, she instructed. They'll keep the worst of it at bay. Thanking her, Clara returned to the manor. That night, as the fog thickened once more, she burned the herbs in the fireplace. The whispers came again, but this time they seemed angry. The shadows in the fog grew bolder, pressing against the windows, and as Clara stared into the darkness, a figure emerged. It stood motionless, just beyond the glass, its form obscured by the fog, yet she felt its gaze upon her, cold and unrelenting. The whispers converged into a single, chilling phrase, "You cannot hide forever." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure outside the window. The fog curled around it like a living thing, shifting and churning in an unnatural rhythm. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, pressing on her chest like an invisible weight. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure remained silent, the only sound the faint whispers that seemed to rise from the fog itself. Clara grabbed the fireplace poker and approached the window cautiously. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she reached out to touch the cold glass. Just as her fingers brushed the pane, the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving only the swirling fog in its wake. She backed away, her mind racing. Was it a trick of the light, her imagination playing cruel games? Or was it something else entirely? Margaret's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust the voices. Clara spent the rest of the night huddled in the library, the burning herbs filling the air with a pungent, earthy scent. The whispers persisted but remained distant, as though held at bay. When dawn finally broke, she was exhausted but determined to uncover the truth about Blackthorn Manor. The next morning, Clara returned to the library and retrieved her great-uncle's journal. She flipped through its pages with renewed urgency, searching for any mention of the figure she'd seen. One entry caught her attention. The fog is not merely a curtain, it is a veil between worlds. There are those who dwell within it, watchers who linger in the in-between. They are neither friend nor foe, but are drawn to the living like moths to flame. To see them is to invite their gaze, to hear them is to risk their touch. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Clara's great-uncle had clearly known more than he let on, yet his writing offered no solutions, only warnings. She needed more answers. Clara decided to explore the manor's cellar. The journal hinted at a collection of old documents and artifacts stored there, remnants of her great-uncle's research into the supernatural. Armed with a flashlight and the fireplace poker, she descended into the dark, musty basement. The air was damp and heavy, the stone walls slick with moisture. Shelves lined with dusty crates and books filled the space. As Clara sifted through the items, she found a weathered map of the manor grounds, marked with strange symbols. One symbol, a spiral etched near the edge of the property, was labeled the Source. Her fingers brushed against a locked box, its surface carved with intricate runes. Beside it lay a small iron key, which fit the lock perfectly. Inside, Clara found a bundle of letters addressed to her great-uncle. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the contents were cryptic. The fog grows restless. The voices speak of an anchor, a tether that binds them to this place. You must not disturb it lest they break free. Another letter read, If the spiral is uncovered, the watchers will awaken fully. Guard it well, or leave this place to its fate. Clara's hands trembled as she read the letters. What was the spiral, and why was it so dangerous? And who had written these warnings? As Clara emerged from the cellar, clutching the letters and the map, a knock at the front door startled her. Her heart raced as she approached cautiously, her mind flashing back to the mysterious figure from the night before. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall and rugged, his weathered coat and boots suggesting he was accustomed to the harsh moorland. "Who are you?" Clara called through the door. "My name's Elias," the man replied. "I'm a historian. I've been researching Blackthorn Manor and its unusual history. May I come in?" Clara hesitated. His sudden appearance felt too coincidental, yet something in his tone seemed genuine. Reluctantly, she opened the door. Elias stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the dim interior. "This place hasn't changed much," he muttered. "I've been studying the legends surrounding Blackthorn Hollow for years. When I heard someone had inherited the manor, I had to see it for myself." Clara frowned. "Legends?" Elias nodded. "The fog, the whispers, the watchers, they're all part of the folklore here. Most people dismiss it as superstition, but there's always a kernel of truth in such tales. Have you noticed anything unusual?" Clara hesitated before recounting her experiences. Elias listened intently, his expression grim. When she mentioned the spiral on the map, his eyes widened. "You found the map?" he asked. "That spiral marks a site of immense power. It's said to be the anchor for the fog and the entities within it. If it's disturbed, well, let's just say things could get much worse." Clara's stomach churned. "What should I do?" "For now, don't go near it," Elias said firmly. "The Watchers are drawn to curiosity. The more you engage with them, the stronger their hold becomes." That night, Clara and Elias worked together to secure the manor. They bolted windows, lit more herbs, and mapped out escape routes in case the whispers returned. Despite their precautions, an oppressive tension filled the air as the fog rolled in thicker than ever. The whispers began just past midnight, louder and more insistent than before. Clara and Elias sat in the library, the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. The voices seemed to surround them, pressing against the very fabric of the manor. "They're testing us," Elias said, his voice tight. "Don't respond. Don't acknowledge them." But then came the knock. 3 sharp raps at the front door, reverberating through the house. Clara froze, her eyes meeting Elias's. "They can't come in unless you invite them," Elias whispered. "Whatever you do, don't open that door." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Clara clutched the poker, her knuckles white. Suddenly the whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and guttural. "Let us in, Clara. We've been waiting for you." Clara's resolve wavered, fear clawing at her mind, but she held firm, refusing to move. The knocking ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. Then, as the clock struck 3, the fog began to recede, taking the whispers with it. Elias exhaled shakily. That was too close. Clara stared into the dying embers of the fire, her thoughts racing. The Watchers were growing bolder, their presence more tangible. If they were tied to the spiral, she would have to confront it eventually. But the question lingered. Would she survive the truth it held? The morning after the harrowing night, Clara woke to find Elias already poring over the map of Blackthorn Manor. His fingers traced the strange symbols, his brow furrowed with concentration. "We need to find out more about this spiral," he said, glancing up at her. "It's the key to understanding what's happening here." Clara hesitated. "You said not to go near it." Elias nodded. "And I meant it, but there might be a way to uncover its secrets without disturbing it directly. There's a local historian, Margaret Steele, who might know more about the lore surrounding the spiral. She lives on the edge of the moor, not far from here." Clara's stomach tightened at the thought of leaving the relative safety of the manor, but she knew they couldn't stay in the dark. "Let's go," she said, grabbing her coat. The two set out into the gray morning, the fog still clinging to the ground in tendrils. The path to Margaret's cottage wound through the moor, the landscape desolate and unnervingly quiet. Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her skin prickling with unease. They reached the cottage by midday. It was a quaint, weathered building with a thatched roof and ivy-covered walls. Margaret, a spry woman in her 70s with piercing blue eyes, greeted them warmly but with a hint of curiosity. "I've heard about the fog acting up again," she said as she led them inside. "It's been decades since it's been this restless." Elias spread the map on the table and pointed to the spiral. "We need to know what this marks." Margaret's expression darkened. "The spiral of Iran," she murmured. "It's an ancient symbol, tied to the veil between the living and the dead. Legend has it that the spiral is a gateway, a tether that keeps the Watchers bound to this place." "How do we stop them?" Clara asked. Margaret's gaze was steady. "You don't. The Watchers aren't something you can fight. The best you can do is appease them or seal the gateway." She handed Clara a leather-bound book. "This contains the old rituals. Be warned, though. Tampering with such forces always comes at a price." Back at the manor, Clara and Elias delved into the book. Its pages were filled with archaic symbols and cryptic instructions, many of which were difficult to decipher. One passage stood out. "To seal the Watchers, the anchor must be severed. Blood binds, blood frees. But beware, for the veil demands its due." Elias frowned. "It's talking about the spiral. The anchor must be connected to the fog itself. Severing it might stop the Watchers, but it sounds dangerous." "Do we have a choice?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias sighed. "We'll need supplies, and we'll have to go to the spiral." They spent the rest of the day preparing. They gathered candles, salt, and herbs from the manor's storeroom, along with a ceremonial dagger they'd found in the cellar. As dusk fell, the fog thickened, and the whispers began to stir. By midnight, they were ready. With the map and the book as their guides, Clara and Elias set out into the moor. The fog enveloped them almost immediately, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. The whispers grew louder with each step, forming an eerie symphony of disembodied voices. Finally, they reached the spiral. It was etched into the ground, the grooves deep and ancient. The air around it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the whispers now a deafening roar. "Are you sure about this?" Elias asked, his hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara's gaze was resolute. "We don't have a choice." Clara knelt at the edge of the spiral, the dagger in her hand. She began the ritual, chanting the words from the book. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending toward the spiral as if drawn by an invisible force. As the final words left her lips, the ground trembled. The spiral glowed with an otherworldly light, and the whispers ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Then, from the fog, figures began to emerge. The Watchers were humanoid but distorted, their forms shifting and incomplete. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their presence exuded a suffocating dread. They encircled Clara and Elias, their attention fixed on the spiral. "Keep going!" Elias urged, his voice strained. Clara's hands shook as she made the final incision in her palm, letting her blood drip onto the spiral. The glowing intensified, and the Watchers recoiled, their forms flickering like shadows under a strobe light. But then, a low, guttural voice echoed from the spiral. "You dare sever the bond? You do not understand what you unleash." The Watchers surged forward, their movements frantic and desperate. Elias threw a line of salt around Clara, the barrier holding them back momentarily. The spiral's light grew blinding, and the ground beneath them cracked, releasing a burst of energy that knocked them both to the ground. When Clara opened her eyes, the Watchers were gone. The spiral lay dormant, its grooves dark and lifeless. The fog began to recede, revealing the moor in its stark, moonlit beauty. Elias helped her to her feet. "Did we do it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Clara stared at the spiral, unease gnawing at her. I think so." Back at the manor, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the fog lifted. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their actions had consequences they didn't yet understand. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, a faint whisper reached her ears. "You've opened the door, Clara. We're not done yet." Her eyes snapped open, the room bathed in an unnatural glow. The fog was gone, but something far more sinister had taken its place. Clara sat upright, her breath catching in her throat. The unnatural glow in her room pulsed like a heartbeat, illuminating the walls with shifting patterns. She reached for the book Margaret had given her, its leather-bound cover cool to the touch, and flipped through its pages, searching desperately for answers. The faint whisper she had heard before now resonated in her mind, persistent and mocking. "You opened the door, Clara. Now you must walk through it." Elias burst into the room, his face pale and drawn. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The air, it's different, heavier." Clara nodded, clutching the book to her chest. "I think we've done something terrible. The Watchers may be gone, but whatever was holding them back has also been released." Elias knelt beside her, his eyes scanning the book. "We need to find a way to close it completely. If there's still a doorway, something else might come through." Clara's hands trembled as she pointed to a passage she'd skimmed earlier. "The severing of the anchor may weaken the veil, but to mend it requires a binding, a sacrifice to restore the balance." "A binding?" Elias asked. "What kind of sacrifice?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Later that day, as the fog began to creep back onto the moor, a knock echoed through the manor. Clara and Elias exchanged a wary glance. Neither of them moved. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" Clara called, her voice shaking. A familiar voice answered. "Margaret Steele, let me in quickly." Elias opened the door to reveal the elderly historian, her face lined with worry. She carried a satchel overflowing with scrolls and vials. Without waiting for an invitation, Margaret stepped inside and slammed the door behind her. "You two have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice sharp. "The Watchers were bound by the spiral for a reason. By breaking their anchor, you've not only unleashed them, but weakened the veil between this world and the next." Clara's chest tightened. "We were trying to stop them." Margaret set her satchel on the table and began unpacking its contents. "Intentions mean nothing to the entities you've stirred. If the doorway isn't sealed, worse things will come through." "How do we seal it?" Elias asked. Margaret held up a small vial filled with a shimmering silver liquid. "This is a binding elixir. It can strengthen the veil, but it requires a living tether, someone willing to tie their essence to the spiral, keeping it dormant." Clara's heart sank. "And what happens to the person who becomes the tether?" Margaret's gaze softened. "They remain bound to the spiral, alive, but not entirely part of this world. It's a fate worse than death for most." The night was thick with tension as Clara, Elias, and Margaret prepared for the binding ritual. The spiral on the moor glowed faintly, as if anticipating their arrival. The whispers had returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. "We don't have much time," Margaret said, arranging the vials and herbs around the spiral. "The veil is thinner than it's ever been. If we don't act now, it will tear completely." Elias paced nervously. "There has to be another way. What if we—" Margaret cut him off. "There isn't. The ritual demands a sacrifice. Without it, we're all doomed." Clara looked at the spiral, its grooves filled with a faintly pulsating light. She thought of her great-uncle, of the Watchers, and of the whispers that had haunted her since she arrived. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Elias grabbed her arm. "Number will find another way." "There is no other way," Clara said, meeting his eyes. "This has to end, and it's my responsibility." Margaret nodded solemnly and handed Clara the vial. "Drink this and step into the spiral. The elixir will bind you to it, but it will also protect you from being consumed entirely." Clara took the vial, her fingers trembling. She glanced at Elias one last time, then drank. The liquid was cold and sharp, sending a wave of energy through her body. As she stepped into the spiral, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The moment Clara entered the spiral, the world around her shifted. The fog thickened, swallowing the moor and the manor in an impenetrable shroud. The Watchers appeared, their distorted forms circling her, their glowing eyes filled with something almost like reverence. Clara felt the pull of the spiral, a force anchoring her to its center. Her vision blurred as the fog wrapped around her, seeping into her skin. She became aware of the veil, its threads frayed and fragile, and willed it to mend. The Watchers froze, their forms fading as the spiral absorbed their energy. Elias and Margaret watched in silence as the spiral's light dimmed and the fog began to dissipate. When the ritual ended, Clara stood in the center of the spiral, her eyes glowing faintly, her expression unreadable. Margaret approached cautiously. "Clara, are you? Clara turned to them, her voice echoing strangely. "I'm here. The spiral is sealed, but I'm bound to it now. I can't leave." Elias stepped forward, anguish written on his face. "There has to be a way to free you." Clara shook her head. "This is how it has to be. The Watchers are gone and the veil is strong again, but you must keep others away from this place. Promise me." Tears filled Elias's eyes as he nodded. "I promise." Weeks passed, and the manor stood quiet and still. The fog no longer lingered, and the oppressive whispers had vanished. Margaret returned to her cottage, and Elias stayed to watch over the property, fulfilling his promise to Clara. Sometimes at night, he would walk to the edge of the moor and see the faint glow of the spiral. He knew Clara was there, somewhere between worlds, guarding the veil. Her sacrifice had saved them all, but the cost was immeasurable. And though the fog no longer whispered, Elias couldn't help but feel that the story of Blackthorn Manor was far from over. Somewhere in the distance, faint and fleeting, a single whisper echoed in the wind. "We will wait."